Hello and good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is John Dudley, and as Interim Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 69th Annual Harrington Lecture. The Harrington Lectureship was established in 1952 by the faculty of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Dakota. Originally called the College Lecture, which I can see why they changed that. The title was changed in 1967 to honor Dean Elbert W. Harrington upon his retirement. As you entered this evening, you should have received a program as well as a copy of last year's lecture by Professor Leanne Rurapa. We also have available a number of previous lectures that have been published that are available at the desk in the front, as well as a historical overview of the lecture written by Dr. Truman Schwartz, who is a distinguished alumnus and a great friend of the college. I want to say thank you to the Harrington family for providing the endowment for this lectureship, and to the staff of the College of Arts and Sciences, and particularly Laura Carlson-McGoey, who have organized this lecture. And we are honored tonight by the presence of a number of past Harrington lecturers, both among our active and emeritus faculty. So at this point, I would like to ask them to rise so we might acknowledge their contributions and their ongoing engagement with the college. So don't be shy. Since its inception, the lecture series remains faithful to its purpose, to serve as an expression of the ideas of a liberal education. According to the lectureship's founding documents, the lecturer shall be one whose record as a scholar and teacher is in the best liberal arts tradition and whose achievement warrants recognition by the entire college. This is certainly the case this year as we welcome the 2021 Harrington lecturer, Dr. Beth Boyd. Moreover, Dr. Boyd's professional background and experiences, the topic of tonight's lecture, and the fact that we are gathered during Native American Heritage Month should remind us that a liberal arts education involves something more than a simple celebration of the past. Rather, it asks us to critically examine our history and ourselves, and to better understand how we, as a college, an institution, and a community, might live up to the values that we espouse. Dr. Boyd is an enrolled member of the Seneca Nation of Indians and a professor of psychology. She currently serves as director of the USD Clinical Psychology Program and is a member of the USD Disaster Mental Health Institute. Dr. Boyd has responded to numerous disasters, working with the American Red Cross, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Indian Health Service, as well as our own DMHI. Dr. Boyd has also been active in service to the American Psychological Association. She is a past president of the APA Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, and the Society for the Clinical Psychology of Ethnic Minorities, and has served on the board for the advancement of psychology in the public interest, the Presidential Task Force on PTSD and Trauma in Children and Adolescents, the Commission on Ethnic Minority Recruitment, Retention, and Training, and the Minority Fellowship Program Training Advisory Committee. She has authored or co-authored several articles and chapters on issues of diversity and social justice, particularly in the context of disaster. Dr. Boyd's talk this evening is entitled Mitakuye Oyasin, We Are All Related. Mitakuye Oyasin, I think is how I should have pronounced that. We Are All Related. Reflections on Learning to Become a Relative. Please join me in welcoming this year's Harrington lecturer, Dr. Beth Boyd.
Thank you. Thank you for the beautiful introduction, and it's an honor to be here in this group with so many previous Harrington lecturers. Thank you all for being here tonight. Excuse me while I just try to not faint or something. Whoops. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right. I stand here tonight on the traditional lands of the Ocheti Shakowin, the 7 council fires of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. I aspire to honor and respect the indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from here and are still connected to this territory. by owning my part in their continued displacement, incorporating Indigenous knowledge into my work, and establishing meaningful reciprocal relationships with Indigenous peoples and communities. And I am not from here. I'm a member of the Turtle Clan of the Seneca Nation of Indians, the Onondaga, the people of the Great Hills, and the traditional keepers of the western door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. You see how nervous I am? I can't even say my. Ugh. So I greet you in my language as well. Nyawaiskeno. Greetings. I'm thankful that you are well. Thank you for the honor also of this lecture. Over the years, I've watched many of my colleagues reflect on liberal arts education, on what they've learned, the work they have done over the years, the contributions they have made, their hopes about the future of their fields. And so I have also done a lot of reflection over this last year. I'd like to give you just a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about this evening. Try to figure out this space. I'm going to start out by giving just an overview, a very quick overview of liberation psychology, a lens I will use to understand the removal of Native American children from families and communities. I'll then give the context for and the history of the Indian Adoption Project that began in 1958 and the many adoptions that it inspired. And I'll end by looking at Native adoptions through the decolonizing lens of liberation psychology. I might need an extra hand here. Between 1867 and 1996, thousands of Native American children were taken from their homes and families by the U.S. and Canadian governments. Most of them were taken to Indian residential schools, as they were called in Canada, boarding schools, as they were called here in the United States. Others were adopted or fostered in non-Native families. Both, regardless of where they went, both had the same goal in mind, to assimilate Native American children into Euro-US or Canadian society and to obliterate their familiarity with their Native heritage. This was going to take care of the, quote, Indian problem that we had in this country. The issue of Native people being dependent upon the U.S. government for education, healthcare, food, etc. It also promised that by requiring all Native children to attend the government-run schools, that they would teach them English and Americanize them, and that within several generations there would be no more tribes. During this time, there was also a concerted effort to terminate the federally recognized status of hundreds of tribes in this country. So I'm going to say just a little bit about liberation psychology because it's going to be the lens that I look at this through. Liberation psychology uses psychological approaches to understand and address oppression among individuals and groups. It's appealing to me because I've struggled for my whole career to take Western psychological approaches and have them help explain some of these issues that I'm going to be talking about. Liberation psychology encourages empowerment, healing, and transformation. It fosters an awareness of discrimination and inequality and fortifies individuals' strengths, affirms cultural identities, and promotes change to attenuate human suffering and improve people's lives. It places individuals in their multiple contexts, including cultural, historical, gender, sexual orientation, socio-political, geopolitical, and other intersecting factors. I'll be using this liberation psychology lens to discuss the Indian Adoption Project and removal of Indian children from families and communities. Okay, sorry. Some of the themes in liberation psychology are these: praxis, the unity of theory and practice, the idea that there is no utility to theory unless there is practice. Critical engagement, taking the critical perspective of and from the oppressed. Decolonization, or working to remove characteristics from the nexus of colonial domination, broadly understood to promote liberation. Affectivity, the importance of emotional dimensions in community work aimed at liberation. Challenging power dynamics in research and practice in relation to marginality and social exclusion through shared action. Historical memory, I'm sorry, I just saw my daughter get up and leave and I was like, oh no, is that bad? She's still back there. Recovering historical memories as a resource in healing and empowering people and communities. The value of cultural practice and enactment and the role of social consciousness aimed at, and practices aimed at its enhancement. So these will be some of the things that I come back to in the end. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Indian boarding schools, but over the last year or so, I have to say something about it as a context. Over the last year or so, we've heard a lot about the Native residential schools in Canada and the many hundreds of bodies of small children that have been found buried around those schools. And we know that there are hundreds of those schools here in the United States as well. We know that the Canadian schools were actually modeled after the schools in the US. And as a country, our consciousness about this history has grown as the bodies of these small children have started to make their journeys back to their homelands and to their families, to their relatives and their communities. In the 1950s, hundreds of thousands of Native children were in government-run schools, and the federal government was realizing that they were paying too much to raise Native children. And the cost of raising them in the boarding schools was beginning to become a problem. So by the mid-1950s, the BIA was realizing that their goal in decreasing Indian dependence on the government by putting children in these boarding schools had failed. And so they began phasing out their administration of the boarding schools. Somebody reminded me to breathe during this, and I forgot that already, so if I'm running out of breath, I apologize. So as they were realizing that this plan had failed, they started turning over the administration of these schools to tribes in some cases, or to churches and religious organizations and others. But the BIA, even though it was getting out of the business of running the schools, still had the goal of assimilating Native children and ending tribes. So many of these children went to non-Indian foster homes, or mostly foster homes at that point in time. But they felt like the boarding schools had failed miserably in ending their Indian problem, which they defined as the government having to pay for Native people becoming dependent on that. So they sought to get rid of that responsibility of caring for Native children, but there was still the belief at that time that Native children should not be raised in their own families, that somehow Native families were not responsible enough to take care of their own children. So in 1958, they hit on the ultimate privatization of raising Indian children, adoption into white homes. By having the children be adoptive, it was actually the adoptive families that would take on the cost of raising the children themselves, and the government would not have the cost of either running boarding schools, which cost them several $1,000s a year per child, and they would also not have the cost of foster care, which cost them several $100s a year. Finally, this would accomplish both goals of A, breaking Native dependence on the government, and B, assimilation of Native children into white society. Reducing the cost of care for Indian children served as the priority, but the BIA and state bureaucrats justified the Indian Adoption Project as a caring program that would rescue supposedly forgotten Indian children and find them permanent homes. So to make this project work, they had a twofold task. First, they had to convince young white families in the U.S. that adopting Indian children was a desirable thing to do. And second, they had to ensure a supply of adoptable Native American children. Named the Indian Adoption Project, the project was marketed as providing homes for America's, quote, forgotten child. There were feature stories in mainstream magazines like Good Housekeeping, Reader's Digest, Newsweek, McCall's, and Redbook, which described these as unwanted children who would have no future without adoption. By this time, the relatively new social work discipline had become a central player in the BIA. I'm sorry if I didn't say, the BIA is the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And although the mid-1950s saw a brief time when social workers focused on keeping families together and reunifying children who were coming home from boarding schools with their families, by 1958, they needed a supply of adoptable Indian children. This turned out to not be a problem, because one focus of the project was to convince unmarried Native women to give up their babies because they would have a better chance in the world being adopted into white families. There was a whole narrative at the time about the psychology of unmarried women having children out of wedlock. The knowledge of the day was that, from the white social worker perspective, was that having children out of wedlock demonstrated some inherent mental instability. The other focus was on children who were being raised by aunties and grandmas. Although culturally this is very common in Native communities, it does not resonate with the American idea of the nuclear family. So many of these children were removed from their biological homes by social workers. Child care by a family member other than a biological mother was considered deviant by social workers who did not recognize these traditional family cultural ties. So the Indian Adoption Project was a federal program that acquired Indian children from 1958 to 1967 with the help of the Child Welfare League of America. In a second wave, this was taken over by the Adoption Resource Exchange of North America, and that ran from 1966 to the early 70s, and also included a variety of private agencies and churches. In the end, as many as 1/3 of all Indian children in this country were separated from their families between 1941 and 1967. In the Southwest, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints took thousands of Navajo children to live in Mormon homes and work on Mormon farms. The Catholic Church and other Christian denominations swept many more Indian children into residential institutions that they ran nationwide, from which some children were then fostered or adopted out. The Association on Indian Affairs in the 70s found that between 25 and 35% of Indian children had been separated from their families, I just mentioned. It's estimated that overall, between 80,000 to 100,000 children were placed in non-Indian homes between the early to mid-1900s. The IAP, here is the Indian Adoption Project. The aims were assimilation and extinction of the tribes as entities, just as it had been with the boarding schools. And the official federal policy of the time was that tribes would no longer exist. So 85% of the children that were removed were placed in non-Indian homes or institutions. No one by the late 1950s imagined a solution to the care of Indian children that involved strengthening Indian families and keeping Indian children in their homes. Most government officials deemed Native families inherently and irreparably unfit, so they ignored the proposition of funding preventative or rehabilitative services to Native families. Policymakers used new terms, but the primary settler colonial goal of eliminating American Indian people remained unchanged. In Canada, this was known as the 60s scoop. Some of the children were placed in foster homes or orphanages. Others would be adopted right away. The goal really that we have to understand was an ethnic cleansing. Not only would the adopted children lose their culture, thus destroying future generations of Native communities, but adopted children would not have treaty rights either. Adopted children would effectively disappear from tribes. The adoptive parents probably never knew of these bigger plans of these projects. All they were aware of was adopting a child that to fulfill their family. So this is the timeline of that era. There was also in the 1950s, the Child Welfare League of America had a narrative that talked about hard to place children. The narrative reinforced whiteness as normative and not whiteness as problematic and even pathological. The Child Welfare League of America spokespeople routinely contrasted what they called, quote, blue ribbon babies who were blonde-haired and blue-eyed, with hard-to-place children, those with, quote, special needs, older children, the physically handicapped, and children of racial minorities or racial mixtures, unquote. Such children were, quote, handicapped by color. The rhetoric of the time characterized white children as normal and in high demand, while non-white children were aberrant and undesirable. They did not blame the plight of the forgotten children on racism and colonialism on the part of the government. They blamed the plight of these, quote, unwanted children on Indian families themselves, that they were unloved and uncared for, setting up white adoptive parents to feel that they were saving these children from families who didn't want them. There was no recognition in all of this of the colonial policies and structural racism that were the actual reason for the impoverishment of Native communities. Remember, by this time, many generations of people had been raised in boarding schools and had no experience of being raised in families or knowing how family relationships worked. The reasons for removal could be just about anything. It could be if a caretaker had a hospital stay, if there was the death of a parent. You remember that Native American spirituality was outlawed at this period of time. It was not legal again until 1978. So a child of someone who might have gone to jail for practicing traditional spirituality would be a reason for removal. Many people talked about that there were just no rights for families at that time. And there are many stories of people remembering the social worker coming over and over to the family, and eventually there's lots of stories of a big black car would come and take the child away. It was common and desirable at this time, and still is, for grandparents to take in and raise their kin. Social workers, however, did not, and please believe me that I'm just telling the story of the time, and that this was the belief of the social work profession at that time. They did not believe that extended family members should care for Indian children, so they promoted more adoption services for unmarried Indian mothers. In reality, they created and magnified a problem that scarcely existed before. Indian families did not stigmatize unmarried mothers and readily incorporated their children into extended kin networks. They were more concerned with raising the children within the extended family close to their culture and community to become good relatives and to help the people. Part of the assimilation was to convince Indian families of the American nuclear family model. The popular culture in the U.S. at that time included a male father figure who worked and supported the family, and the woman who worked at home and raised the children. This was the ideal, and what they saw in Native families often did not fit. The split feather syndrome, this is a term used by Carol Locus in 1990 to describe the wounds Native adoptees suffer caused by the loss of tribal identity and growing up different in an inhospitable world. The term split feather refers to adult Indians who were placed in non-Indian homes as children, and the split feather syndrome refers to the set of psychological, social, and emotional wounds experienced by these individuals. The difference in this research was that it gathered information from the adoptees themselves about their own experiences and found that placing Native American children in foster and adoptive non-Indian homes puts them at a great risk for experiencing psychological trauma that leads to the development of long-term emotional and psychological problems in later life. Some of the reasons for this have to do with the issue of race. Parents who adopt children of another race are confronted with issues of race and culture. Children who are adopted by a family of another race face identity issues that are significantly different from those who are adopted into the same race. And as they try to define themselves biologically and socially, they must seek information from a culture that's different from that which they are living in order to develop that identity. Because racial differences are so visible, transracially adopted children adopted by families that are of a different race, cannot escape the community reaction and comment about the differences between themselves and their families. Since most white adoptive families have not experienced racial discrimination prior to the transracial adoption, they're often unprepared for the negative attitudes of relatives, friends, and neighbors. Worse, as they are unsensitized to these issues, they may be totally unaware of the attitudes, prejudice, cultural, and institutional racism to which their adopted children are being subjected. Many parents who adopt transracially naively assume that their love for the adopted child will be sufficient. However, in these situations, the major parenting task is to instill in the adopted child a strong sense of racial and personal identity, without which the child will be overwhelmed as they grow up. Parental support for this sort of socialization is essential to the adoptee's self-esteem and the sense of social acceptance in a community which is often also racially different. One study showed that by adolescence, transracially adopted children showed a special vulnerability due to their dislike of their own ethnic features. Ironically, the adoptive parents reported that they were unaware of the color or race of their children. This lack of awareness and failure to acknowledge real identity issues leads to more risk for the children. In adoptive families, it's often too threatening for the family to focus on even the obvious differences of the adopted child. Adoption typically takes place in families where fertility has been a painful problem. To focus on evidence that the child is not biologically part of the family is to be reminded of the painful reasons for the adoption and often a sense of inadequacy. There is often a high value placed on minimizing the differences between the child and the family, focusing on how much the child is part of the family in order to bring the family together. This may be positive in many ways. The child may initially benefit from this focus, but as the child moves into the pre-adolescent years, and as other children become more aware of racial and ethnic differences, the child will begin to experience identity confusion and needs extra support during that time. Lost bird is another term that refers to one of the earliest Native adoptees Zintkala Nuni, the lost bird of Wounded Knee. Lost Bird was a Lakota infant who survived the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, sheltered under the frozen body of her mother, and was claimed as a war trophy by a general who named her Lost Bird. This story was told by our own Renee Sandstone Flood from this community in 1995. Lost Bird grew up in this general's family and endured a lot of intolerance and isolation. And she was actually quite famous. There was a lot of newspaper coverage of the massacre and the adoption. When she rebelled as a teenager, she was shipped back to her family where she no longer fit in. So she joined the Buffalo Bill Wild West show and toured with the show for several years. She had 2 children of her own that passed away and one that she adopted out. She died in 1920 of influenza at the age of 30. Renee Flood tells us she never gave up hope that she would find out where she really belonged. She talked about a yearning inside to be a relative, to be a part of something greater than what she was individually, to know her place within the community or the tribe or her nation, to know her relatedness to everything else. I believe it's something that's not just learned. It's a story that adoptees tell again and again. It's almost like it's something hardwired, a pull that people feel back to their native roots. A lot of people who have been adopted out have this feeling and describe this experience, and some have called it blood ties. I think anyone can understand that there will be short-term impact of placing a child outside the family. You can imagine the grieving process even an infant would go through. But what we haven't understood for years is the long-term, lifelong impact of how people develop and who they develop into in the ways that they cope with their lives. These are some of the impacts that have been described by Native adoptees about their experience. Fears that their families and communities would not accept them back, that what's called the adoptee stigma of living in 2 worlds, the fact that adoption records are sealed so the truth could never be known, and that was on purpose. That was a part of it. Feeling of never fitting in their environments, a feeling of something being missing, feelings of being totally disconnected. Even in the best of situations, Native adoptees live without a sense of who they are. And even in a loving adoptive family, love doesn't provide identity. If you're disconnected, it is difficult to know yourself as a relative. Being a relative requires you to know yourself relative to others. When you don't know where you came from or who you are, it's difficult to understand how you belong and how you are a relative. You have no roots, no beginning, no stories, and no future. Of course, in reality, you actually are a relative. You do have that. But if you can't feel it and you don't know it, what does it mean? And this is something that is talked about again and again by Native adoptees. Also the painful curiosity as adoptees try to figure out who they are and why their families gave them away. Even when at times where people know a story, know in their head that there's a reason, sometimes it's hard for them to figure to put that together with feeling given away. A lot of times names are changed by an adoptive family. So a child who goes by a certain name is suddenly known by a different name. So names don't mean a lot in some situations. Feelings of inferiority about not being white, trying to be accepted by the white community that they find themselves in, never looking like anyone in their family. People thinking, when they go to look for their family members, people thinking that they are after something. These are things that people talk about regularly, that as well as the shame of not knowing their culture, not being connected, not having the language to talk about the experiences of living in the white world and how, although that might look like privilege, it was also part of the oppression. While well-intentioned, many adoptive families denied the children's Indian heritage. Changed their children's names and caused them to grow up in communities where there were few, if any, others who looked like them, held similar beliefs, spoke the same language, or shared the same culture. I really do need 3 hands here. A survey by the First Nations Repatriation Institute in 2012 and 13 heard from 336 total respondents. 129 of them identified as American Indian, and 95 had been adopted out, but also in contact with their birth families. And these are the numbers that of adoptees who had experienced mental health issues as a result. A 2017 study from the Centers for American Indian Alaska Native Health at the Colorado School of Public Health found that Native children adopted away from their families were more likely than their white counterparts to struggle with drug abuse, alcohol addiction, suicide, self-harm, and other mental health issues. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted, and it set standards for child custody proceedings involving Native children who are members of or eligible for membership in a federally recognized tribe. This came about because tribes started to understand what a large proportion of the children they were losing from the tribes. And there was a lot of pressure, congressional testimony documenting the devastating impact that this was having on Native children, families, and tribes. And the intent was to protect the best interests of Indian children and promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families. So it added some protections so that in the event that a child needed to be placed out of their home, that first a Native home, a familial home would be sought first, an extended family home, or at least a tribal home. If that wasn't possible, then first of all, the tribe and the family would be notified of custody proceedings, but even in the situation where a child needed to be placed outside of the child would be enrolled in the tribe first. So the tribe still had the child as a member. The child would know where they belonged, and this did not happen during up until 1978. Although the progress of ICWA has made a great deal of difference, but there are still many, many, many cases where ICWA has been just ignored or not followed, not complied with. The ICWA, or Indian Child Welfare Act, it lacked an official oversight agency at the federal level. There's no national data collection apparatus, and there's no enforcement authority. So as a result, compliance has been uneven. And I know in many tribes, the numbers of, and in any social work setting, there are a shortage of caseworkers. They're overcrowded in terms of their cases. There's lots of paperwork, and it often just goes by the wayside. Even after the passage of ICWA, there are many out of home placements made of Native children. In Alaska, Native children make up 18% of the child population, but they are 55% of the children in foster care in that state. In South Dakota, Native children make up 15% of the state population, child population, but 53% of the children in foster care, and that's today. These other states around us have similar sorts of numbers, and now there's even an even bigger concern for ICWA. because there's an argument that ICWA is unconstitutional because it's based on racial discrimination. The U.S. District Court in AU's District Court in Texas has also agreed with that idea, and also written that it violated states' rights by forcing them to follow a federal law and yield to tribes. This decision is like a bombshell for child welfare and tribal advocates. And tribal law experts say that it goes against decades of legal precedent and has the potential to rewrite the way all Native Americans relate to the United States. If this law goes down, this law is being backed by big oil in Texas, and the fear is that if this law goes down, that it will be the first in a domino effect that will eventually affect Native sovereignty. The federal government, joined by the tribes, appealed the case, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals heard arguments in Louisiana in March. Now everyone just is awaiting the outcome, and whatever side loses the next ruling, they expect to ask the Supreme Court to hear the case. So this is something that's happening right now that we don't yet know what the outcome will be. So what do we learn from this history? Why is it important? Why do we need to tell this history? So far, the history of Indian child removal has been told primarily from the perspective of those who did the taking. Changing the narrative about the removal of Indian children, remembering, restoring, telling the real history is the way that we can begin to heal and make real change. So I'll use the liberation method of testimonial to talk about my own story, my experience. I was born in 1958, and my mother was 14 years old when I was born. My mother and I lived with my grandmother and my great-grandmother in Cattaraugus, one of the 2 Seneca Nation of Indians reservations in western New York. Apparently, my family was visited numerous times by social workers who tried to convince my mother to put me up for adoption and that I would have a better chance at life if she did. At about 9 months of age, I was removed from this home and went to several foster homes and then the county orphanage. Around the age of 3, I was adopted by my adoptive family, a white couple who had not been able to have biological children. I grew up on an island in between Buffalo and Niagara Falls, about a mile upstream from the falls. This was actually Seneca territory, but was no longer in the possession of the nation. This would have been considered a border town, although I don't remember that word growing up. So there was a great deal of racism about Native American people in that area. So my parents told people that I was a Korean War orphan. When I started school, I was the only non-white student and had a difficult time with kids calling me derogatory racial names. So I did the only thing that I could at the time. I gained a reputation for fighting. For the first part of elementary school, my desk was in the hallway and I was permanently kicked off the school bus. Everything changed for me in the 3rd grade when my teacher proclaimed that I was turning over a new leaf, and I actually did. I was used to not looking like anyone in my blonde-haired, blue-eyed family, so people regularly asked my family, "Where did you get this one?" All of these experiences made me hate that I was different, because all I really wanted was to fit in, to belong, and to be one of them. But I did not have the words to explain that to my family. And I didn't have the words to explain to my family how this discrimination hurt me, and they did not have the experience to realize how I felt or help me cope with it. When I was 14, we were in upstate New York visiting my grandparents, and we went to an old Western-themed amusement park. There was a Native man there dressed in traditional regalia with a group of people around him, and I wandered up to the edge of the crowd to listen. he stopped what he was saying in mid-sentence and looked straight at me and said, "Are you Seneca?" I remember feeling as if the world had stopped, and in slow motion, I looked at my mother, who just nodded her head. For me, everything changed at that moment. It was the first clue that I had to who I actually was. And it felt like it was the first time that anyone had actually seen me. As I got to teenage years, the yearning to know who I was and where I came from only grew stronger and created more confusion. So I went through many of the things that other Native adoptees did. It was never okay for me to talk to my adoptive family about finding my biological family, because they felt that as rejection. So I couldn't start trying to find more information until I was an adult. And then I found that New York State is the most difficult state to get adoption information because the records are sealed. I tried for many years with no luck. It actually took me 40 years to finally get my actual birth certificate that I got in July of this year. Because Governor Cuomo, one thing, I know he has many problems, but one thing that he did was he thought that any adopted person should be able to see their actual birth certificate. So he unsealed the records in New York. The next time I actually felt seen was when my son was born. And I couldn't stop staring at this being who looked like me. For the first time in my life, I looked like someone. That was maybe the first real stirrings of understanding what it meant to be a relative. I didn't know how to be a relative. I'd spent most of my life feeling like an outsider, someone who did not fit in. I didn't see a way to fit in. I was adopted. I didn't look like them. I had a different experience in the world because of being Native, and they didn't know how to help me with that. So I didn't tell anyone. I never tried to tell anyone. I just internalized it and felt like it was something inherently wrong with me. Sandy Whitehawk, who is a Sicangu Lakota adoptee from the Rosebud Reservation and the founder of the First Nations Repatriation Institute, said that when we grow up, quote, "When we grow up in a white family, in a white community, that's all we see and know. We don't know anything about being Native, and most white people don't know anything about who we are. You don't have your image mirrored back to you in any way. That's a distortion as you develop your identity." I think that's very accurate. Unfortunately, you also internalize the dominant colonial ideology of white supremacy, and so you never know, you know that you can never be that. And you internalize the messages that you've experienced about being Indigenous as well. Even when the messages are negative, you still develop a racial identity of sorts, a sense of self in society, how you are relative to others. So many people of color, and particularly Native adoptees, for many Native adoptees, the process of socialization with white culture tends to produce a negative self-image, limiting self-concept, low self-esteem, and a lack of self-love. So with all that, how could you know how to become a good relative? So the Lakota concept of wellness, illustrated in the medicine wheel here, involves a balance between the creator, the natural world, and the physical, mental, emotional, and the spiritual aspects of the self, as imbalances in any of these might result in individual or communal dis-ease or illness. This was to become very important to me as I was learning to decolonize the experience that I had in order to heal. So I came to USD in 1992. The first Native person I met here was during the interviews was Dr. John Williams, who was then the director of what we called the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Studies program at that time. I met him for 30 minutes during my interview here. One of the things that he said to me after hearing my background was that I had no idea what it meant to be Native, but this was a good place to learn. I came out of his office knowing that I needed to come here to learn from him. And in tears, I had to find a place to cry for a minute because once again, it felt like someone saw me. Once I moved here and enrolled my children in school, Kathy Prasick, who was the Indian education coordinator at the public schools at that time, called me to ask about my children's enrollment numbers. I immediately got defensive and steeled myself to explain yet again that I had been adopted before ICWA and had not been enrolled with my tribe. After I sort of angrily explained this, she very gently said, "I understand. I was adopted too." These were moments that I felt seen and created a community for me here in Wasay-Wakpa, the native community of Vermilion. And I learned how to be part of a native community, and I started to understand what it meant to be a relative. In about 1994, I was sick. Western medicine was not very optimistic. A doctor casually told me, "You have 8 to 10 years," and then seemed really surprised when I was devastated to hear that. All I could think of was that was not enough time to raise my 2 young children. So without knowing anything about what I was doing, I turned to the community who guided me to ceremony. And that saved my life in more ways than just having to do with my physical illness. In order to heal physically, I was going to have to learn how to be a relative. Healing in native ways is a communal process of rediscovering balance within self and the harmony between self, creator, and the natural world. Healing, like wellness, creates many lessons in the context of family and community, and the process begins with humbling oneself to ask for help and healing. In order to ask for help and ask for and receive help, I had to realize my connection to others and accept the help of family and community to prepare myself for a healing ceremony. I needed to recognize I am no more and no less than anyone else, which is the basis of many of the problems experienced in life. For some, learning to be humble means realizing that we're not above others. For me, it meant learning I was not below others. I asked for healing and then participated along with my family and community members in preparation of the ceremony itself, and any prescribed follow-up. The spiritual healer informed me of the reasons for my difficulty, the form healing would take, and most importantly, the responsibility I needed to assume for my own healing. The ceremony itself is a communal event where commitments are made and witnessed by relatives and community. I, as the patient, and my family were not only empowered, but required to be full participants in the healing process. This culture is medicine approach may differ in detail across tribal communities, but the principle is similar throughout native cultures. Finally, participants are encouraged to give thanks and give back to the community. In this way, people practice generosity and reciprocity, feel valuable and contributing to the community, and recognize the efforts of others, thus enhancing their own sense of being a relative, in balance and wellness, and ensuring that the community goes forward in the future. Looking at these processes from a liberation psychology lens, we anchor our knowledge in the lived experience and historical memories of the people and communities who have been oppressed. We challenge the power dynamics of oppression and know the strength and resilience of the people. Those of us with marginalized and oppressed identities must find opportunities, and that's probably all of us in some aspect of our lives, must find opportunities to recenter our experiences if we're to challenge the oppression it represented. In this presentation, I used a liberation tool, testimonial, first-person narration that expresses my psychological experiences as a participant. Liberation psychology in general fosters a critical consciousness that helps people to understand the mechanisms of oppression, fosters a sense of personal agency, and encourages engagement in personal and collective social justice. A decolonial psychology would mean moving away from the assumption that the individual is the central unit of analysis in ways that overlook people's social, economic, and political contexts. It's important to recognize these contexts and the oppression we experience and the healing that we take part in. The psychological, cultural, and emotional impacts of these adoptions I've talked about tonight are still reverberating throughout the Native communities today. And this is not to say that non-Indian families cannot successfully raise healthy Native children. Sometimes it's necessary for a child to be placed outside of their community. But it's important to keep those family, community, and cultural ties so that child can remember who they really are and where they come from. I hope that telling the story in this way highlights the importance of being connected to community and maintaining that tie, even if children have to be adopted out. Being part of a community requires us to be a relative, teaches us to be a relative, and allows us to remember the connections of the culture that we came from. For a Native adoptee, it's like coming home to our relatives, coming home to our community, and coming home to ourselves. So, in closing, maybe it's just because I am teaching a diversity class this semester, but one of the things that I ask students to reflect on is who they are in an overall picture of diversity as a relative in the world. Some have a ready answer for this, and others, it is a jolting question, something they had never thought about before. But by this point in the semester, they're all beginning to have an emerging sense, a newly emerging sense of self, of who they are relative to everyone around them. And it reminds me of this process that I've gone through, which I've told you about. I've learned that who I am is relative to those around me. Any difference that I may have made is because of the people around me. The teams that I've had the privilege of being part of, the DMHI, the Vermilion Ambulance, the Wasai-Wakapa community, the USD, the psychology department, the clinical psychology program, the American Psychological Association, the Seneca Nation of Indians, they've all helped form me as a relative. But in the environment in the past several years, in the midst of all of the stressors of a worldwide pandemic, we have had some shocks to our sense of diversity and being a relative. We have seen a man murdered in front of our eyes for 9 long minutes. We have seen that incident was not a unique situation. Just as many of us watched the World Trade Center burn and had the horrible realization when we saw the second plane hit the other tower, this was not an accident. This is not a unique situation. This is happening here and is happening now. In the months that followed the death of George Floyd, the whole world became sensitized to the issue of race and racism and racial conditioning that we struggle with here in the United States. And here in South Dakota and half of the other states in the Union, we are attempting to deconstruct the supports that have taken years to construct. The supports for students who come from minoritized backgrounds, the things that support them while they are here, away from their communities and away from their relatives. I've spent most of my 30 years on this campus helping to build those supports, changing the language from one of tolerance of diversity to acknowledging diversity to even celebrating diversity. And I can't help but feel that the way we are going now is devaluing that work. In fact, when I was asked to speak, I really felt at a loss about what to say, because I feel that the work I have spent my career doing is no longer of value in the institution I work in. When you've been adopted, you're always vulnerable to that feeling of being, quote, kicked out of the family. But then I had to ask myself again, who am I? And I had to remember that who I am depends on who I am being as a relative. And I want to thank my students for that. I made it almost all the way through. I learn something each and every time I teach a class or mentor a student. The enthusiasm of these students for learning about and changing the world is so healing and so inspiring. They are different because of this last couple of years, because of what they have seen, what they have experienced, and what they have heard from others, and the courage that they have to go forward in this world, in a world that seems so complicated and confusing right now. Many of them weren't even born when 9/11 happened, or maybe were just toddlers, but their 9/11 will be the killing of George Floyd. It took their innocence, changed their world, and pushed them to learn how to become allies and relatives for the people in their lives and people they don't even know yet. So thank you to my students. Your courage to find who you are has helped me to decide who I am again. Thank you, Yahweh, in my language. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Beth. That was fantastic. We all needed to hear all of that, so thank you. My final job this evening is the introduction of next year's Harrington Lecture, as selected by a faculty committee in the college. I am very pleased to announce, and I believe that person is here, I'm very pleased to announce that the 70th Harrington Lecture will be delivered next year by Dr. Cliff Summers, Professor of Biology. Cliff, if you're here, please stand up so we can recognize you. There you are. I'd like to invite everyone to enjoy some conversation, to speak with Dr. Boyd about her amazing talk, and ask questions and speak with each other, of course. Before we do that, however, I would like to invite our colleague, Dr. Gary Cheeseman from the School of Education, who has some words he'd like to say and to conclude our program.
Thank you and good evening. In native cultures, in the Lakota culture, we like to honor our people in very special ways. We'd like to do that tonight with Dr. Boyd, Jeff, and Sister. And we'd like to present her with a star winner. And in the process of doing that, I'm going to sing an honor song. And what you folks can do as I'm singing that is we'll run back and come by the front there. We'll be standing here with a couple of our elders in the community. You can shake their hand. Before I say that, let me just say this. When I got here in 2009, one of the first things I did is I wanted to know who was here, especially who was here in the Native American. Again, to read a lot about the people here, a lot of the articles that was been published, and so on and so forth. And I ran into this Beth Boyd, and I started reading these articles, and I thought, this is an unbelievable woman at the time, and you've just heard about everything that she's done. And we've only scratched the surface of what she's done. And I'm so just incredibly proud to be a native person, to be a colleague of hers. But I got to tell you what I'm most proud of. I'm one of the quote-unquote leaders of the Sundays here in Wasilla. And ever since I've been here, I've been watching Derek walk around our Sundance carpet with the hand of these small, young women. She's been a grandmother, a mother, and a sister to everybody out there. And most of all, she's been there for me, especially these young girls in which she is such an incredible role model. And she's inspired all of us to do it. So with that, I'd like to begin this honor. Well, I'd like to invite our two elders up here first. I'd like to do that first, Kathy and Diane. Kathy Classic, who Beth mentioned, is Diane Williams, who is begin, then you can circle around and come by and shake her hand. She's a